call your name. Days get long, I call your name. Days get broken, set my spirit free. Oh, Lord, remember me.
Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions. Thank you for joining with us. This evening we're going to look at two chapters, Judges chapter 7 and 8. That way we're going to bring a conclusion to the story of Gideon. I think up to this point we could say about the story of Gideon that it's made a good start and has, well, I guess a little bit more of an unclear middle, but very sadly is going to end badly. Instead of moving from fear to faith, it would appear that Gideon begins to go in that direction of faithfulness, faithlessness, and self-assertion. There seems to be some clues that the author just wants us to pick up on as we go through chapter 7 and into chapter 8. Well, I'm going to call upon my mate, David Suchet, again to read for us.
Judges chapter 7. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps, from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah, and listen to what they're saying. Afterwards you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah his servant went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them, with torches inside. "Watch me," he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, Then from all round the camp blow yours, and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position round the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth-shittah, towards Zererah, as far as the border of Abel-Meholah near Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of Jordan ahead of them, as far as Beth-barah." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeeb at the winepress of Zeeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. Judges chapter 8. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. But he answered them, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you?" At this, their resentment against him subsided. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. He said to the men of Succoth, "Give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Succoth said, "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops?" Then Gideon replied, "Just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars." From there he went up to Peniel, and made the same request of them. But they answered as the men of Succoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, "When I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and attacked the unsuspecting army. Zebah and Zalmunna, the 2 kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Heres. He caught a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth, the elders of the town. Then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, 'Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men?'" He took the elders of the town and taught the men of Succoth a lesson, by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel, and killed the men of the town. Then he asked Zebah and Zalmunna, "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" "Men like you," they answered, each one with the bearing of a prince. Gideon replied, "Those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you." Turning to Jether, his eldest son, he said, "Kill them." But Jephthah did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid. Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Come, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." So Gideon stepped forward and killed them, and took the ornaments off their camels' necks. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites, and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-Berith as their god, and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in spite of all the good things he had done for them.
The opening section of the chapter deals with quite a drastic deselection process. I guess if we talk today about military cutbacks, this is a military cutback. The two armies are opposed to each other. They're both camped, and Gideon is instructed to cut back on his numbers. Those who have responded are a sizable number. Something around 32,000 have gathered. Well, clearly, Gideon would have looked at that and thought, well, at least that gives us a fighting chance. But the intention that the author wants us to see is that the battle is going to be God's, that the victory is going to be his. So if Gideon and the Israelites feel their own strength, then they, of course, would draw the conclusion that it was they that won the battle. And so this process of deselection begins, which, of course, arrives at that place where 32,000 are whittled down to 300. Well, that would appear to be utter madness. We're talking here about the Midianites, the Amalekites, and some other nations who have gathered and camped on the plain. Clearly, you have some of the most powerful ancient nations of the world gathering. It would appear madness. You're now going to face the might of the Midianites with a whittled down force. It makes no logical sense. Even when there were 32,000 there, well, they were still under-resourced in terms of the power and the resources of the enemy. Now, the odds are completely stacked against them. If we've already arrived at that conclusion, and I think that's part of the author's intention, that God uses some unusual and untypical people to carry out his purposes, well, if we haven't fully grasped too that God uses the strangest at times methodology to carry out his purposes and plans, then this is going to prove to be the defining moment. Who, in their right sense, would do such a thing? But as the author wants to tell us, God uses the most unexpected people and uses the most unexpected tactics to carry out his purposes and plans. And we will see that again time and time in the book of Judges. It's interesting that Gideon, even at this point with the two armies camped opposite each other, that he needs further confirmation. He wants to be sure at this critical moment, who can blame him? He's just whittled down the army to 350, that this is right, that this is the right thing. So together with his servant Purah, he's invited to sneak under the cover of darkness into the tents of the Midianites. Of course, that means he gets to see their vast numbers and their military might. But what is significant, he also overhears the dreams and the thoughts of the Midianite soldiers, and they are shaken because they fear what is about to happen. That God is with Gideon and his army, and they will be overcome. The side that has the military advantage, which of course has increased every time that the army of Israel, the tribal groups, has been whittled down, the one that is under-resourced and against impossible odds is striking fear into the hearts of the Midianites. Only God can do such a thing, the author wants us to understand. Gideon returns enthused and reignited in his vision to lead this great victory over the Midianites. Isn't it ironic that he's more prepared to accept the word of the Midianites than he is the word of God to assure him that the victory is his? And so the tactics are set. Each man is given a trumpet, a torch that is covered over with a glass jar, and they're divided up into 3 companies. I think the author at this point wants us to grasp just how ridiculous this all looks. At every level, this is hilarious. What is going on? And then the battle happens. Well, it's not really a battle, it's more of a spoof. The trumpets sound, the glass jars are broken, the light from the torches is released and revealed, and all this takes place under the cover of darkness. The battle cry goes up, and the Midianites panic and flee in terror. And in all the confusion, they end up fighting each other. The 340 soldiers, or 300 soldiers rather, they don't even have to fight them. They're fighting themselves. The cry goes up now for the rest of the Israelite tribes to join in and to root out the enemy. The rout and the victory is going to be completed. The battle belongs to the Lord. But notice how it belongs to the Lord and Gideon. I think the author wants us to picture at that moment something's not quite as it was. he's inviting us to think, well, it's the Lord's battle. It's not the Lord's and Gideon's. And it's almost as if the author is saying to us, Gideon is no longer this servant, the one that we met in the winepress. He's now seeing himself as an equal partner. It's a defining moment, but of course it will prove to be a very temporary moment too. Two things emerge as we move into chapter 8. Firstly, division, and secondly, revenge and brutality. Firstly, the divisions and the jealousies between the tribes is made obvious. This isn't one nation. We talk about the nation of Israel. It doesn't really exist in reality. It's a series of dysfunctional tribes. And they're filled with jealousy about each other. And of course, it's the Ephraimite tribe that bring their complaint. You want us to be involved at this point, but you didn't invite us to be involved when the victory was going to be achieved. We're called in too late. We've missed out. Well, of course, even though Gideon is able to placate them for the moment, it reminds us that the disunity of these tribes will continue to be a feature in the book of Judges as it unfolds. Well, they do say that your moments of great victory are also your moments of weakness and vulnerability, and this will prove to be the case for Gideon. And then we go on to see the brutality of war. In the mopping up operation, we see a very different side to Gideon. He responds, first of all, to the taunts and the lack of support from the people of Sukkoth with a message of revenge. You laugh now, you doubt me now, but later on I will punish you for that. And of course, that same response is carried out with the people of Peniel. The same response and the same threat. And note how it's Gideon now pursuing the Midianite leaders. It's no longer now even the Lord and Gideon. It's all about Gideon. Isn't it ironic that Gideon himself, who needed so much more assurance that he had heard right from God, well, when the people of Sukkoth and Peniel, they want reassurance, he's not willing to grant it to them. They will face the consequences of not supporting him and providing provisions for his forces. So having completed the capture of Zebah and Zalmunna, he seeks out revenge. The revenge over the people of Sukkoth and Peniel. And he carries it out, following on with the execution of these Midianite leaders. It's quite a brutal section by the brutality of the time, and perhaps even today. Well, you might even think it's quite normal. But somehow the author wants us to see that this young man that we first met in the winepress, threshing the wheat for fear of the Midianites, where's he gone? He suddenly becomes somebody very different. And in this long section, notice that there's no reference to God. God has disappeared from the story. And I think the author is trying to help us to see that. Things are not as they should be. And they won't be now throughout the rest of Gideon's story. Well, the next section begins fairly optimistically. We sense that Gideon has lost his way, but here he reaffirms his own belief that Israel, these tribes, are to be a theocracy. They're to be ruled over by God. And so he dismisses very quickly the idea or the invitation to become king over the nation. and for that to be a hereditary position for his children and grandchildren. He seems to make the right decision when he says, the Lord will rule over you. Well, the ongoing challenge of kingship will become an increasing feature within the book of Judges. And of course, that will take us into 1 Samuel and the eventual crowning of King Saul. But for the moment, this is to be a theocracy, a nation ruled over by God. But then Gideon makes this very strange request. The request for gold to make this ephod. Now, an ephod was a priestly garment, and this one is going to be made out of solid gold. About 19.5 kilograms, I was about to say kilometers then, kilograms of gold. Well, by modern estimates, that's worth about 17.5 billion pounds. Can you imagine, even at that time, how much all of that was worth? It's very excessive. And then, of course, to make it matters much more worse, this isn't going to be set up in one of the recognized shrines of the tribal groups. This is going to go back and be set up in his own village, which signifies that there's something going on in Gideon's mind here. Of course, the fact that it's going to be there will ensure that he's not forgotten. Pilgrims will continue to come to his village. And sadly, as we see, they will come to worship before this ephod. In other words, it becomes the means of renewed idolatry. Did Gideon mean for that to happen? Well, perhaps not. Could he have stopped it happening? Probably he could have done. And once more, we're losing sight of the young Gideon who was at the threshing wheat in the winepress. I think the author is up to this point has drawn some parallels between Gideon and Moses, but now that's changed, and the parallel here is between Gideon and Aaron, Moses' brother, the priest. Because of course it was Aaron, in response to the cry of the people, who set up the golden calf, the image maker. And I think the author wants us to understand that Gideon now has become another image maker. The man who had set out by tearing down the altar of Baal in his own village has now become the one who sets up an altar of idolatry. Gideon's death is told in this final section. We're told that 40 years of peace follows, although given the nature of the story, Gideon seems himself to have been fairly active. His life is long by ancient standards, and it ends peacefully when he's buried in the family tomb in his own village. However, the cycle begins again, and Gideon and his family are soon forgotten. The story started well. Some questions were raised during the middle section, but now the story ends very badly. And of course, that is beginning to set us up for what yet is to come in the book of Judges. Story after story that will increase our sense of discomfort and concern.
Chains get broken, set my body free. Oh, Lord, remember me.